Morning Year 12. This is Mr. Ferreira, and I'm going to be talking you through the next part of the attachment topic on multiple attachments and the role of the father. Now, in this particular video, I do try and reduce the content down to some of the main ideas, and I know that it will be worth your while to go into the online textbook and have a look at the double spread they have on the role of the father. I'm not convinced that this is a topic that does require you to write an extended essay, certainly maybe an 8-mark essay, but not a 16-marker. However, you can use the studies that I use as evaluation, and also if you kind of strip away kind of the name and details about it and tell me what the study says, then you could use that as knowledge. So let's get into this. So first of all, I just kind of briefly talk about multiple attachments. And what we find in the multiple attachments aspect of this is it's quite interesting to see that it says here the primary attachment figure is not necessarily the person spends the most time with. So time spent is not necessarily an indicator of what you mean by primary attachment. And by primary, I'm going to talk about it being mostly the first attachment, possibly the most kind of important attachment, but when we look at multiple attachments, we too talk about the fact that there is an element of these attachments being kind of equal. It's not Bowlby's idea. Bowlby spoke about attachment being monotropic, that there's a hierarchy, there's one attachment more important than the other. So primary is mostly first, and therefore important because it is first and not necessarily more important. And I suppose this particular slide does talk about this idea that just because you spend time with the child doesn't mean that you're going to be the primary attachment, because I know that the notes are slightly obscured, but we see here that it's about spending interaction and responding, it says here, to the signals with the most skill. So if you were going to couple this with the first topic in terms of the attachment topic in terms of caregiver infant interactions, we see that about reciprocity, that kind of recognizing, especially Isabella spoke about how if you can kind of pick up these signals that the baby is offering in terms of interaction, you're more likely to have a strong attachment. And so that's why the primary attachment doesn't have to be the person who's always there. And so that's important for you to recognize. I also don't want to kind of diminish the important job that people do have in terms of caring for their children, because obviously if your child is hurt and you're able to kind of help them and kind of nurture them, that's actually really, really important. The baby's not going to be thinking, well, hang on, I want my preferred adult to come and help me. They're just going to need comfort. So there we go. So multiple attachments. That's kind of the start of it. So let's look at some of the things that we do can say about this. Okay, so Schaffer and Emerson was a key part of the previous kind of section that we did, and we see here that it says that 29% of children had secondary attachments within a month of forming the primary attachment. So what we find is that the first primary attachment kind of sets up this framework for them to kind of form more than one attachment. And we see quite nicely that after about a year or so, it says the majority or the majority of them had multiple attachments. So this is the norm, that children will form one attachment and go on to be able to form more than one attachment. We also find that there's a couple of things that we should talk about in terms of the previous section in terms of stages of attachment. We see here that 31% of infants displaying 5 or more attachments. So yeah, 5 seems quite reasonable, and it's important for us to kind of recognize that this is kind of siblings, the grandparents, other adults or carers that are around, and certainly if there is more than one parent. It's not important kind of that the number is 5, but more that there's this idea that it's multiple attachments. Now, just briefly with this, it's not that we have a finite amount of attachment to kind of give out. Each attachment is seen as being important and shows a kind of a strong link. And when we look at the types of attachment, we can perhaps determine what type of attachment a child will have to these different people. So for me, I feel that that's quite enough to kind of say about kind of the possibility that multiple attachments do exist. And so the next kind of logical step for me is to look at the role of the father. Now, this could be something that you need to think about. Maybe spend some time considering kind of what your initial reaction to this is, because we all come from different contexts. There's some people who don't have fathers. There's some people who have single parents. Some people have two fathers in terms of kind of homosexual kind of men adopting children. There's a whole kind of host of different things that we could say in terms of the role of the father, and maybe your context could determine that. So you might have a few problems with the role of the father because your father was absent or kind of not there, or you could have a very positive experience of the role of the father. But it links really nicely with this multiple attachments, mostly because in terms of multiple attachments, if you do have a two-parent household, you're going to have the mother and the father potentially in this particular context. So the next attachment that's likely to form is to the other adult in the house. So a couple of things about this particular statement. It says that fathers were less likely to become primary attachment figures, and we see that it's 39% of the fathers. Now this is actually quite a nice high number, in my opinion, to say that if we look back at the Schaffer and Emerson kind of Glasgow study, where we had more than a majority of them would have probably been breastfeeding, we had traditional households where the husbands go off to work, those types of things, to still find 39% of the fathers to still be the primary attachment figure, I think is fairly positive. But what we do need to recognise is that if we're going to look at who the primary attachment figure is, we're more likely to have the primary attachment figure to be the mother rather than the father. If you read into the Schaffer and Emerson study, it's about 55% of the mothers were the primary attachment figure, so that's a bigger number there. It also means if you add them all up together, the 55, the 39, that there is also a percentage of these children who had their primary attachment figure to be somebody other than the mother or the father. So really quite interesting there. So obviously men are less likely to become the primary attachment figure. So of course Lamb could give us some kind of answers or evidence as to kind of why this may be. And perhaps it's something which might be really obvious to you, this idea of lacking emotional sensitivity. That men potentially don't have the skill to be the primary attachment figure because they lack emotional sensitivity. And so Lamb says it's not because they don't spend time with the child, it's because perhaps they don't know how to. It goes on to kind of say that there could be a biological reason for this, and that could be obviously estrogen that we have within the body, and females do have more estrogen than men, and therefore that could be a component of it. But he also says there could be cultural expectations that could expect people to potentially not engage with caring of the children. And it is important for us to kind of take note of that as well. But I do kind of come back on this and kind of counter. I know this is not an evaluation section, but we do have this idea that we need to question kind of this idea of kind of making it too gendered. And it says that there's no difference between men and women with regard to their ability to become the primary attachment figure. So fathers can. So it says men do form secure attachments with their children. So therefore the role of the father can be of primary attachment figure. Frank talks about kind of situations where potentially the father is around and a primary attachment figure, but it says then in this particular context that both parents tend to share the roles. So maybe this is a kind of cultural thing as well, because the expectation that men are not expected to be the primary carers, and if they are, there's often a sharing of roles, and certainly maybe the biological component of the female in this particular context kind of doesn't want to relinquish the child caring kind of over to the male. But of course, society may allow men to kind of hand over the childcare responsibility, and so often the opposite way around, men don't necessarily share the roles if their partners are taking primary caregiver roles. So it says that men can be primary attachment figures, but potentially biology and society may discourage this. So important for us to kind of weave this into some kind of argument if we're going to talk about the role of the father. Now, a big kind of player in all the attachment stuff is going to be Bowlby. So let's see a couple of things that Bowlby says here. So first of all, it says that basically fathers can fulfill the roles often taken place by mothers. Okay. But we see a couple of things here, is that this is published in 1988. He initially published one of his research, The 44 Thieves, in 1944. So this is a significant kind of later time in his academic career, possibly coming towards the end of his career, where people were beginning to criticize kind of his notion that potentially mothers look after the babies and fathers go off and do work. And so it's quite interesting. He does kind of say this. He says, yeah, men can do this, fathers can do this, but he says it's uncommon within many cultures. And certainly the culture, or the kind of the background that I have growing up in quite a patriarchal kind of male-dominated society, that was pretty much the case. That was uncommon for men to fulfill those particular roles. And so if they're not taking on those particular roles, Bowlby says here that the father is more likely to engage in physically active and novel play. And as such, we see that we have a difference here between the male and the female, saying that the physically active and novel play goes to the father, and the mother tends to become the child's preferred companion. So the mother kind of has that emotional care, and the father kind of has the novel play. There could be a practical aspect to this. I know certainly in my own experience, if I was at work all day and I was going to come home at 5:30, if I was lucky, and maybe spend an hour, maybe an hour and a half with my children before they went to bed, I certainly didn't want to be the bad guy. And I know Billie Eilish may have differences of opinions in this, but certainly I don't want to come home and kind of be moaning at the children. I kind of often just would kind of play with them, kind of engage with them in some kind of, kind of novel play with them in order to kind of make it a positive experience for both of us. I'm sure my wife may think things differently than what I do in this particular context. Then the next person that perhaps I really like to kind of talk about is this person called Field. I think Field and certainly a few other researchers were really pivotal in kind of getting the Labour government to kind of change maternity kind of expectations. And certainly when they presented their case to Gordon Brown, the Exchequer of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, he did automatically change kind of maternity leave to 6 months. Following that, it became 12 months, and so maternity leave was extended to 12 months in that particular context. So Field is kind of very much experienced in this type of research, and he's looking at the primary caregivers and saying if it is the father who's the primary caregiver, that basically they had more skill. They pretty much were able to kind of smile and do the imitative behavior that you would expect in terms of reciprocity, that was different to fathers who aren't primary caregivers. And so it says secondary caregiver fathers were less comparable in this particular behavior. So it does kind of link quite nicely to the idea of sensitivity and things like that. And so therefore, just to kind of end with, we just need to kind of make some kind of broad statement about research and saying that the gender of the caregiver is not crucial. And that it is often how the father or the mother gets involved. And so if you're able to facilitate this and kind of do this, it becomes a lot more positive rather than negative. And there you go. As I said, kind of not a particularly long section in terms of my notes. I try to summarize some ideas about the role of the father. And if you want kind of more information, please go to your Illuminate second edition version of the notes of the textbook, and you can see they have a double spread on this. Thank you for listening, and I hope it's been informative. Take care. Bye.